Hello and greetings from a sunny Totnes in South Devon in England. My name is Rob Hopkins and I'm really honoured to be able to speak here for the Prioriterre Energy Transitions Conference, especially on this, your 30th birthday of running these conferences. So thanks very much. And I was in Paris recently for an event that was organised by the French president, which was looking at the potential of what an economy, a post-growth economy might look like, and it was held in the National Assembly, and it was very, very interesting. And I got a very clear sense there that within France at the moment, as the nuclear plants come to their close, which were of course built as an urgent response to the energy crisis of the 1970s, there's a big debate been going on in Parliament and in wider society about where do we go now? What do we do now? As those plants become very tired and reach the end of their lives, what does the energy future, what does the energy transition for France look like? So I hope that what I might be able to do in this presentation is give you a sense of what transition can contribute to those to that thinking and to those discussions. And one of the people who spoke at the event in Paris was Nicholas Stern, Lord Stern, who wrote the very famous Stern Review, looking at climate change and the economics of climate change. And one of the things that he said, which I'll come back to later in this presentation, is he said, we have to talk about economic growth because otherwise the Chinese and India won't take us seriously when we sit down to talk about climate change with them. And that's something that I really, really want to challenge, because that feels like a really dangerous assumption that somehow we all have to keep talking up the idea that economies grow forever in spite of all the indications that maybe that's not such a good idea. You know, we don't apply that same idea that an economy grows forever to our children or to the plants in our garden. You know, everything grows to a size which is its right size and then kind of stays around that sort of size. So for me, what transition looks at is firstly that question about economics. What's the most appropriate economic model to have now at a time when our economies across Europe and across the world are kind of starting to slow down or to contract even? What's the most appropriate thing to do in the light of the energy crisis that we face, and also in terms of the climate crisis? And often these things are looked at in isolation from each other. So here in the UK, our government is so fixated on the idea that we have to make the economy grow every year that it's turned to fracking of gas, with all of the environmental, all of the climate implications of that as the only way to re-stimulate that sort of growth. So transition is founded on the observation that we have reached the end of the age of cheap fossil fuels. It's not to say we are about to run out of fossil fuels, but we've come to the end of the cheap fossil fuels. The things that we get excited about now as the new fossil fuel opportunities are things that 10, 20 years ago we wouldn't even have looked at. They're much more expensive, they're much harder to do, they require a lot more energy to get the energy back out again, and it becomes harder and harder to build a growing economy on these kind of fossil fuels. At the same time, the climate science is saying 2/3 of all the fossil fuels we already know of in the world, that we've already mapped, have to stay in the ground if we have any chance to stay below 2 degrees. And for me, the climate change issue goes beyond the idea that it's just about driving a bit slower, turning the thermostat down a little. When you look at the scale of the cuts we need to make to stay below 2 degrees, actually what we're looking at is a profound shift in the scale of what we do, that it no longer makes sense for an apple from New Zealand to be cheaper than one from France. So for me, what comes to the fore is the idea of a more local, more resilient kind of an economy, and that's what we've been looking at in transition. And alongside that, there's also the way that our economy is increasingly being dominated by fewer and fewer businesses. Here in the UK, 97% of all groceries and fresh food sold in this country now is sold through 8,000 supermarket outlets. And our small independent economies, which are what gives our local economies their resilience, are in decline. And I understand that the same pattern can be found across France as well. And we know that actually if we want to have an economy in the future which is lower carbon, which is more resilient to fluctuations in energy prices, which creates more local economic resilience, we need to focus on growing that small independent economy, not allowing the large chain store economy to continue to expand and drive the others to extinction. So central to transition is the ideas of localization, not the idea that we localize everything, but the things that make sense economically to localize, that we do that, particularly food, building materials, energy generation. And we see that as an enormous opportunity, as an economic opportunity. The second one is resilience, and really resilience is about the ability of our local economies to withstand shock from the outside, so that when they encounter the unexpected, everything doesn't fall to pieces. So having strong local food networks, for example, makes a place more resilient. Being less dependent on fossil fuels makes a place more resilient. Having stronger kind of culture of people setting up enterprises that meet local needs, employ local people, run trainings, that kind of stuff, makes a place more resilient. So resilience is a really important thing to put alongside sustainability, I think. There's the whole idea that we need to bring assets into community ownership, that where possible a community should own land, buildings, infrastructure in the town, to hold that in community ownership rather than everything increasingly being owned by people from outside. It should be low carbon. We should be looking at creating everything that we put in place being as low carbon as possible. We should be working to sit within the limits, within natural limits, not assuming that there'll always be as much of anything as we like, but realizing that we need to live within limits of water, management of soils, that kind of thing. And lastly, I think the economy that transition tries to create should be not just about personal profit, but running enterprises that offer a social return as well. So transition, I guess, has really emerged as a way of saying we need a new economy for this time. We need a vision for what this could be like. And actually the communities can lead that and can have a big role to play in that. That's not to say that transition or communities or whatever you want to call it can do everything. Of course, we need national government. We need local government. We need business. But what transition does is take a vital piece of that, play a really important role of what communities can do in terms of starting things, instead of changing what politicians think is possible, changing the sense of what we can do at this time. So transition, I guess, is started here in this town of Totnes in Devon and has spread all over the world. There are now transition initiatives in 43 countries around the world, thousands of communities that are doing this. It's really an open source experiment that involves many hundreds of thousands of people. It's an absolutely thrilling thing to see rolling out around the world and to see what people do. And I have a very privileged position, sort of sitting and hearing all these stories coming in from around the world, whether it's the township in South Africa who are using old plastic bottles as the building blocks for affordable housing for local people, whether it's the email we got from people starting transition in Iran last week, whether it's in some of the favelas in Sao Paulo, where transition has been a catalyst for a whole explosion of new businesses and a new economy in those very poor communities. It's thrilling to see something that has had that viral spark and is also spreading across France now, popping up in all kinds of different places. So you might be listening to this thinking, okay, transition sounds like an interesting thing that we might be able to do and to apply in our community, but how do we get started? How does this process even start? Well, transition always starts with a group of people. They might already know each other, they might meet at an event, they might meet in a bar, but it's a group of people who come together and decide, we want to do this. This feels like something that is right for this place, that we feel inspired to get started. And very often in modern society, we've become so individualistic that we've lost maybe the ability to work with other people and communicate with other people and be part of a group without all ending up taking each other to court for slander after 6 months. So a lot of what Transition Network does is offer groups resources and tools and training to enable those groups to really work. How do you set them up in such a way that everybody communicates well and you have clear expectations and you know how it's going to work? So that forming in groups part is really, really important. And you may feel, I'm the only person in this place who would be interested in transition. Nobody else where I live would be interested in transition. But I heard a story a while ago of a woman in Australia who lived in a town who was convinced that she was the only person who would be interested in transition. Nobody else around here would be remotely interested. She put an advert in her local newspaper that she would like to start a transition group, and she got 120 replies. And that was where her initiative began. One of the other things that needs to happen quite early is some thinking about scale and focus and actually how big an area is our initiative going to cover. You might think, okay, we are transition. Do we want to have transition Paris? Is it realistic to have one group trying to transition the whole of Paris? Or actually, would you be better just to focus on your street? And generally there is somewhere in between. And transition usually works on a neighbourhood scale. So in London, for example, there are now something like 50 transition groups across London, but they each focus on their own neighbourhood, that area which usually has a name and is they're part of the city, which feels like maybe the village that it was originally, their identity within that city. So transition works best on that scale. You may then have a citywide network that enables all those people to share their experiences, but being clear from the beginning about the area you intend your work to cover is really important. Then having a vision, having some sort of having the group come together and generate a vision about what you want to do. How would this place be if its carbon footprint were half what it is today? If oil cost $200 a barrel and we had planned for that in advance and we'd created something within which we could thrive and come alive and feel better connected to each other and meet all of our needs, what would that look like? And all too often when we talk about a post-growth economy, a low-carbon economy, people's mental picture is that less means worse, that having less stuff, having less energy to drive what we do means that somehow we'll be more miserable and progress will have gone backwards somehow. Having a vision about what that would look like in a way that is really inspiring and that people can imagine it and almost in their minds see it and feel it and taste it and touch it is really important. And transition groups use all kinds of different ways to generate that vision with as many people in the community as possible. So there is something there that people feel they want to create. It's almost like you throw a whirlpool in front of you that then starts to draw you towards it as that vision starts to really embed in. Engaging your allies, trying to build partnerships is the fourth step, I think, in terms of how do you, a transition group, however dynamic and however involved they are, will struggle to do this without engaging lots of other organisations in the town. How do you work with your local council? How do you work with your local schools? How do you work with as many different local groups as you can so this feels like a community-wide push to achieve something historic? I sometimes say that when a transition group has its launch event, it should do so with the thinking that in 20 years' time there'll be a plaque put up outside on the wall to mark that historic occasion that began this process of transition in the community. And that can only happen if you can bring together other organisations. So skillfully working with those other groups and building those alliances is really important. And inspiring other people to join you is really important too, in terms of having raising awareness, running events that people feel excited about going to, where they can feel part of this process, learn about peak oil, climate change, these economic arguments that underpin this whole process. So finding inspiring ways to invite people to be part of it is really important. But alongside that, the last one, I suppose, is about doing things. The book that we just published is called The Power of Just Doing Stuff. And it's a title that we chose because all of these other things only really matter when it also translates into people making stuff happen, coming together to create stuff, whether it starts small as a community food garden or coming together in someone's house to look at how energy is used, or running a market stall to tell people about transition. It can start small with those things, but it grows from that. And people find confidence from doing things. And in my experience, when you actually decide you're going to do something, whether it's just to take a corner of the park and grow food in it, to turn your front garden on the main street into an orchard or something, when people see somebody else decide they're going to do something, and to take that step from thinking about it to actually doing it, then other people come in to support that. I've seen it again and again and again. There's goodwill for that. People will lend you tools. People will come and help. People will get behind the whole process. And it starts to change people's sense of what's possible. One of the first things that we did here in Totnes was planting nut trees and fruit trees in public spaces. Very simple to do, but it started to kind of change the story about what we do in our public spaces and so on. So doing things is really important. It gives you confidence. It breeds that sense that something else is possible. So in Portugal, in a place called Porto Alegre, the transition group there came together and took a small piece of ground between an apartment block and a shopping precinct. And the people in the tower block came out and turned this place into a garden with the support of the transition group. It's small, it's not going to feed Porto Alegre, it's not even going to feed one family in the apartment block, but what it gave people there was a confidence. It gave them a sense that, well, if we can do this, what else can we do? Maybe we could do that. That was such good fun. People found they were coming together, they had things to talk about again. So that stage of doing stuff is really, really important. So that's really the things that we've observed are the best ways to get started with those 6 things there. Forming a group, establishing the scale and focus of what you want to do, establishing a vision of what you want to do, engaging your allies in the community, inspiring other people through an awareness raising, and actually getting on and doing stuff. And you'll find on the Transition Network's website, transitionnetwork.org, all kinds of resources to support you through doing each of those things. So, but where is transition now? Where have we got to? Well, I think we've got somewhere really exciting. After 7 years now of an experiment, an open source experiment that is running across the world, I think we're getting to a stage now where we have some really dynamic projects on the ground that are starting to change the sense of what economic development over the next 10, 15 years might look like. Transition Network has recently published 3 what are called economic blueprints, looking at a different community, so a market town, a county, and an urban neighbourhood, and mapping the economies of each of those places. How much money is spent on food? How much of that money is spent through independent businesses? How much is spent through supermarkets? How much is spent on energy, on care for the elderly, that kind of thing. So actually being able to start to put a value on how much money, what's the economic case for transition, for a more localized economy. So here in Totnes, for example, where we did one of those blueprints, we mapped the local economy in detail. And now for this town of 8,500 people, with the surrounding area maybe about 20,000 people, we know that we spend £30 million every year on food, of which 20 million is spent through just 2 supermarkets. So we know that more than half of what we spend on food goes out through just one supermarket. And we have a much bigger, more vibrant local food economy here than most other parts of the country. So we now know that there is a really strong economic case for that. And the same would apply in all kinds of different places. If we can spend our money in different ways, rather than waiting for some imaginary cavalry to come riding to our rescue as the economy gets worse and worse, we can become our own cavalry. We can actually pick that up and create a low-carbon economy that's vibrant, that creates more work for people, that builds economic resilience at the local level. I think that is a big idea of the 21st century. And at this meeting organised by the French president, that was what I laid out and said this is really the direction we need to go. This is the new form of economic development that we need. So, for example, in Brixton, London, we see Brixton Energy, a community-owned energy company, which has now done 3 big share launches with local people, often people on very low incomes, investing money in a community energy company that they own, which is now putting renewable energy in place on some of the poorest housing blocks in Brixton, as well as training young people in how to install renewable energy and generating money for energy efficiency to help those people lower their energy bills. Fantastic project. In Bristol, the Bristol Pound local currency scheme for the city of Bristol, which is now taking many hundreds of businesses, a lot of support from the city council. The mayor of Bristol takes his full salary of £51,000 in Bristol pounds in the local currency. And lots of other city councils are now looking at that as a really exciting model for how to make the economy of the city more resilient. I visited Crystal Palace in London recently when we launched the new book. The transition group there have only been going for 2 years. They've started a community garden that won the Mayor of London's Community Garden Award. They've started another 5 gardens across the city. They've started a project called the Palace Pint, where they're growing hops in back gardens and pub back gardens all across the area to produce hops for a local beer. They've started a social enterprise, Palace Preserves, where they collect fallen fruit throughout their part of London and turn it into jams and stuff, which they then sell through local restaurants. They're starting Palace Power, a community-owned energy company. They've started a very, very successful new local food market there. That's just a group of people who met and decided they wanted to do it. And one thing has given confidence to do another thing, has given confidence to do another thing. And that's what transition can do, which is really, really exciting, I think. Here in Totnes, which has been going longer than most other transition groups in the UK, we now have started about 40 different projects here in the town. We have a local currency scheme. We've done an economic blueprint for the local economy. We're now on the verge of becoming a developer, of being part of taking over a former 8-acre derelict site in the middle of the town and turning it into a hub, a catalyst for a new economy in action. We have a community-owned energy company. Transition has become one of the big stories about the economic future of this town. And again, that's people deciding they want to make that happen. We can be our own developers. We can be our own farmers. We can be our own economic development agency when nobody else really seems to be doing that. So that innovation comes from local people, and it's really exciting to see. So going back to Nicholas Stern, when he was speaking at the meeting in Paris, and his sense that we have to talk about economic growth because otherwise China won't take us seriously when we talk about climate change. I think that's really, really deeply flawed and a really dangerous argument, because actually China now are flying ahead and they're looking at setting very real carbon targets in their next 5-year plan. And also the idea that China is actually interested in what the British government decide to do is somewhat arrogant at this stage, I suspect. But I think that the time is right, actually, for a government to come out with a new story, with a story, say, for the UK, for example, to say North Sea oil and gas is nearly finished. We realise we are hugely dependent on fossil fuels for what we do. We realise that we have let our local vibrant economies that give communities their resilience be almost completely wiped out by huge supermarket chains and big retail. And actually we want to allow those economies to regenerate. We want to protect those economies. We want to stimulate social enterprise. We want investment to create a social return. There's a new story there about vibrant high streets, local food, energy generated in such a way that some of that money is held and retained by local communities, about new buildings being built in such a way that people don't profit from them so that it destabilizes the economy, that people can build homes using local materials, rediscovering vernacular, local ways of building, but to very, very high energy efficiency standards, training young people in skills again, where they learn how to build with those materials, learn to grow food, where edible landscaping is just part of our experience of walking around the towns and cities where we live, where we don't need a car because bicycles are so fantastic, public transport is so fantastic, and actually saying that we measure how well we're doing not by economic growth, but by well-being, by happiness, by community cohesion, by community resilience, by economic vibrancy. That's how we look at where we're going. And actually, I think if we started to see countries saying that, a lot of the other nations that are sort of pushing for growth because that's all that seems possible will breathe a huge sigh of relief. And we can actually look more sensibly, more sanely, and more wisely at the future that we might be moving into. And at that meeting, the president of the National Assembly in France, he said, we must learn to live differently, less ostentatiously, and in greater solidarity with others. So I hope that transition is something that might help to inform the debates, the discussions that you'll be having at your conference. I hope it's something that maybe some of you have seen or experienced in the places where you live. I hope it feels like something that you might be able to pick up and do where you live. You might be able to pick up and bring some people together in the community where you live and make that happen. On the Transition Network website, there's a bit called Transition Nearby where you can type in your address and it will tell you what's happening where you live. There is a Transition France network that you can find Googling and see what they're up to. And there are increasingly resources that are being translated into French. The beauty for me of transition is that it feels like an open source thing. It feels like something which doesn't belong to anyone. So when transition pops up in Brazil, it feels like a Brazilian thing. So transition in France is developing its own identity as French transition, not some English thing that has been imported, but transition should feel like something which is French and which arises out of that culture. But I hope that it's something that you will find a useful contribution. If you'd like to know anything else, have a look at transitionnetwork.org. I hope this has been been a useful contribution, and I wish you all the very best with the rest of your conference. Thank you very much.